He told the world he was a grieving husband, that he had loved and lost, not once but 3 times. One wife killed in a plane crash, another taken by cancer, a young son stolen by leukemia. Hollywood embraced him as the tragic widower, the man who bore his pain in silence, until the cameras rolled. But what if none of it was true? Behind the polished courtroom speeches and monster movie cameos, Raymond Burr was living the greatest role of his life, a role not written in any script. This is the story of a man who lied, not for fame, but for survival. Raymond Burr came into the world on May 21, 1917, in the small, fog-draped town of New Westminster, British Columbia. A modest beginning for a man who would one day be known by millions, not for who he truly was, but for the mask he wore. His mother was a piano teacher, his father sold hardware. There was nothing glamorous about his childhood, no sparkling Hollywood origins, no whispers of fame in the air, just the quiet rhythm of a working-class Canadian family trying to make ends meet. He was born large, 12 pounds to be exact, and he stayed large. By the time he reached 12, Raymond Burr looked like a grown man. And this is where the first layers of his mythology began to appear. Years later, he claimed that he left school at that very age and traveled alone to New Mexico, where he found work as a ranch hand. It sounds unlikely, even absurd, but in the shadows of the Great Depression, with a single mother raising 3 children, desperation had a way of bending reality. Perhaps a boy that size could convince the world, or at least himself, that he belonged among men. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. That's the maddening mystery of Raymond Burr. What we do know is that long before he became a star, he had already discovered something much more seductive than the spotlight: the art of fabrication. While others clung to truth, Burr realized something darker, that people don't really want facts. They want a story. And if he told it with enough conviction, they'd never question whether it was real. So while most boys were still figuring out who they were, Burr was already learning how to become someone else, and he would keep becoming again and again for the rest of his life. If Raymond Burr couldn't outrun his body, he could at least outtalk it. That was the silent understanding he carried with him when he joined the Pasadena Playhouse in 1937, the same year he began carving out a space for himself on the airwaves. Radio didn't care what you looked like, only how you sounded. And Burr's voice, deep and commanding, wrapped in gravel and resonance, was a revelation. On stage, casting agents saw only his size. He was too heavy to play the hero, too broad to be cast as a lover. But on radio, he could be anyone. A romantic lead, a tragic figure, a gentleman with a secret. In that invisible world, Burr wasn't just accepted, he was desired. And for the first time, he wasn't boxed in by his body, he was free. But Hollywood was a different beast. In the 1940s, as the film noir era began to unfurl across the silver screen, a curious need emerged. Studios were overflowing with clean-cut leading men, the ones who walked off into sunsets with perfect smiles. What they didn't have were believable villains, men with presence, menace and mass. That's when Raymond Burr's phone began to ring. He didn't walk through the doors of Hollywood. He smashed through them. Broad-shouldered and towering, Burr had a face that could freeze a scene. He became the heavy, the classic noir brute who lingered in alleyways, stalked femme fatales, and scowled from the shadows. It was work, and it paid, but it wasn't what he wanted. Not really. He once bitterly described himself as the fat heavy of film noir. He was in his 20s, but casting directors handed him the roles of older men, twisted souls, wounded thugs. In one film, he played the father of an actor younger than himself, a cruel joke of makeup and typecasting. But nothing stung more than this. No matter the film, no matter the script, Burr never got the girl. The hero kissed the heroine. The villain, Burr, got handcuffed, shot, or forgotten. He was stuck in a loop, intimidating, tragic, replaceable. It didn't matter how well he acted, how deeply he understood his characters. He wasn't cast to feel, he was cast to loom. And even when the roles took a turn toward the bizarre, like Gorilla at Large in 1954, a 3D curiosity in which Burr shared the screen with a literal ape, the joke never stopped. Burr could stand next to the monster, but he could never be the man who saved the day. Still, he played his parts without protest. He knew what Hollywood needed from him. He gave it to them, scene after scene. But deep inside, a different role was forming, one no one had offered him yet. A role he'd have to fight for, and one that would change his life. By 1954, Raymond Burr had become a fixture in Hollywood, not a star, but a shadow. He haunted the edges of the screen, bruising, brooding, inevitable. And just when it seemed his typecast rut might bury him, an unlikely opportunity came stomping in, on giant reptilian feet. In Japan, a film was making waves. Gojira, the tale of a colossal creature awakened by nuclear testing, had gripped a nation still scarred by Hiroshima. Its themes were serious, its mood apocalyptic. But in America, few had the appetite for foreign-language films, especially ones involving giant lizards. That's when distributor Edmund Goldman had a strange idea. What if they didn't just translate Godzilla? What if they remade it from the inside? So they did. They took the original footage, inserted new scenes, and hired an American actor to anchor the entire thing. That actor, of course, was Raymond Burr. Suddenly, Burr found himself in a movie he never auditioned for, surrounded by characters he never met, on a set that didn't exist. It was movie making by illusion. They rebuilt parts of the film in Los Angeles, hired Asian American stand-ins to match the Japanese cast, and stitched Burr's character, an American journalist named Steve Martin, into the chaos of a Tokyo under siege. It was clever. It was crude. It was wildly experimental. And it worked. But what fascinated people even more than the film itself were the stories Burr told about making it. One version claimed he shot all his scenes in just one day, a brutal, continuous 24-hour sprint. Another version said it took 6 days. The tales changed with each telling, gaining tension, romance, even heroism. No one really knew what happened on that soundstage, but Burr's myth had already begun to grow teeth, like the creature he shared the screen with. The truth? Burr enjoyed it. He liked the strange process, the surreal blending of East and West, old and new. For once he wasn't the heavy, the killer, the forgotten father. He was the calm center in a storm of destruction, the eyes and voice of American audiences, and maybe, for the first time, the star. Godzilla. King of the Monsters became a cult hit. Burr, oddly enough, became part of cinematic legend. But more importantly, he realized something deeper. If you tell a story well enough, convincingly enough, no one will care if it's real. And just like that, the actor who had long been trapped in the roles others wrote for him began writing his own. By the mid-1950s, Raymond Burr was still orbiting the edges of Hollywood, reliable, recognizable, but never adored. He had played villains, monsters, and murderers, men who smoked in shadows and never got the girl. He had helped repackage a Japanese monster into an American myth, but now he was about to step into the spotlight and finally become the hero. The opportunity came not from a movie, but from something many actors at the time considered beneath them: television. Producer Gail Patrick Jackson was casting for a new courtroom drama based on the best-selling novels of Earl Stanley Gardner. The lead character was a brilliant, impenetrable defense attorney, Perry Mason, Burr came in to audition, not for Mason, but for the role of the district attorney, Hamilton Berger. But as soon as Jackson saw him read, she knew instantly this wasn't the prosecutor. This was Perry Mason. Well, almost. There was one problem. Raymond Burr, as usual, was too heavy. Television was unforgiving, and Jackson told him directly, lose the weight or lose the part. For a man whose size had always defined his career and his self-worth, this was a gauntlet thrown. But Burr didn't hesitate. He went on a brutal crash diet, shedding the pounds like a man fighting for his life. And when he returned for a screen test, Gardner himself, the author who had created Perry Mason, reportedly stood up and said, "That's him. That's Perry Mason." And just like that, Raymond Burr became the face of justice in America. When Perry Mason premiered in 1957, no one could have predicted what came next. Week after week, viewers tuned in, 30 million of them every Saturday night, to watch Burr solve the unsolvable, defend the innocent, and outwit the guilty. He didn't just play Perry Mason. He became him. Gone were the twisted sneers and thug roles. Burr was now a symbol of moral clarity, confident, intellectual, emotionally untouchable. The letters poured in by the thousands. Women adored him. Men admired him. America embraced him. But this new identity came with a price, because now, for the first time, people weren't just interested in the character. They wanted to know about the man behind him. And that was when Raymond Burr's greatest performance truly began. The moment Raymond Burr became a household name, the questions began. Who was he when the camera stopped rolling? Was he married? Did he have children? What kind of man played Perry Mason with such stoic passion? At first, Burr gave the public a simple, believable version. Yes, he had been married to an actress named Isabella Ward. They'd met before his career took off, lived briefly in the basement of his grandparents' home, and then quietly separated a few months later. She returned to Delaware. The marriage ended without drama, without scandal, and that part, oddly enough, was true. But Burr, he didn't stop there. No, this is where the embellishments began to bleed into fiction, and fiction into pathology. He told reporters he had married again, a woman named Annette Sutherland, a promising actress, beautiful, elegant, a tragic figure. According to Burr, she died in a plane crash, the very same crash that killed British film star Leslie Howard during World War II. It sounded romantic. It sounded devastating. It also sounded completely fake. There was no record of Annette Sutherland, no name on the passenger manifest, no obituary, no trace. But Burr wasn't finished. He said he had a son, a sweet 10-year-old boy who had succumbed to leukemia. The pain in his eyes when he spoke of it was convincing. His voice cracked just slightly. He'd say, "That's why I don't like to talk about my personal life. It hurts too much." People believed him. How could they not? He was Perry Mason, the moral compass of primetime America. And now, he wasn't just a hero on screen. He was a grieving father, a widower, a man who had suffered more than most. But none of it was real. The wives were fabricated, the child never existed. The grief, manufactured. And the more he talked, the deeper he had to dig the trench of fiction. Because once you start building a life around lies, the only way out is silence. Or more lies. When people started noticing the inconsistencies, when the timelines didn't add up, or when someone asked to see a photograph of the boy, Burr responded not with answers, but with more tragedy, more death, more heartbreak. He even invented a third wife. Her name? Laura Andrina Morgan. Another supposed great love, another cancer victim, another ghost in his ever-growing cemetery of invented sorrow. Each story served a purpose, each one carefully constructed. Because for Raymond Burr, the truth was more dangerous than any lie. The truth risked everything: his career, his image, his legacy. So he built a wall made of fiction, and behind it, he hid the one thing Hollywood could never accept in 1950s America: who he really was. Behind every tragic widow story, behind every tear-stained tale of love lost and a son gone too soon, there was always something missing, something unspoken, something oddly untouched. And then one day, someone knocked on Raymond Burr's dressing room door. It was the early 1960s. Perry Mason was at the height of its popularity. Burr, exhausted and overworked, opened the door to find a young, handsome, aspiring actor named Robert Benavides. He had come to deliver a script. That was all. But for Burr, that single knock was a turning point. He didn't just hire Benavides as a personal assistant, he invited him into his world. Not the public one filled with courtroom monologues and fan mail, but the private one. The one where the lies ended and the truth could finally exhale. Soon, everyone on set noticed. The way Burr looked at him, the way Benavides never left his side. They were always together, not just on set, but everywhere. Vacations, charity events, long drives north. They were inseparable. But this was the 1960s. Hollywood didn't just discourage open queerness, it annihilated careers for it. One whisper could ruin you. One headline could end you. And Burr knew that better than anyone, so he did what he had always done. He hid. To the press, Benavides was his business partner, his longtime friend, a quiet presence in the background of red carpet photos, but never a romantic partner, never a companion, never what he truly was. And the irony? The man who America believed was always grieving, always alone, always mourning the past was, in fact, deeply loved, and deeply in love. The fabricated wives were never about sympathy. They were camouflage, a strategy. Burr didn't create these women because he was sad. He created them because he was terrified. Terrified that if the world saw Robert, really saw him, they'd turn on both of them. So the lies multiplied. Because the stakes were too high. Because the truth had never been safe. They bought property together. They built a life on a sprawling estate in Sonoma County. They opened a winery. They entertained quietly, lived generously, worked side by side. And all the while, Raymond Burr continued to lie, not to Benavides, but to the world. And yet, the people closest to them knew, the crew knew, the neighbors knew, the industry knew. But no one said a word. Because in some strange silent agreement, those who loved Burr understood that the performance wasn't just for the audience. It was protection, and maybe, just maybe, it was survival. When Perry Mason aired its final episode in 1966, many expected Raymond Burr to slow down, maybe even disappear from the screen altogether. After all, he had just spent 9 years carrying one of the most iconic shows on television. Most stars would take a breather. Burr did the opposite. He launched himself straight into another leading role, this time as a paraplegic detective in Ironside. The show, debuting just a year later, once again put him in front of millions of Americans every week. Once again, he played the calm, commanding center of justice. And once again, he had an excuse to dodge the one question that never went away. Why is Raymond Burr still single? The answer, publicly, never changed. He was too busy, too committed to his work, too exhausted from his shooting schedule to even consider dating. And at a glance, it seemed true. Ironside ran for 9 years. Then came specials, guest appearances, interviews, charity work, and quietly, always, Robert Benavides. still by his side, still called a friend. But no schedule could fully explain it. Other TV stars had marriages, scandals, affairs. Burr had nothing, or so it appeared. In reality, his personal life was stable, consistent, loving, and entirely hidden. So he leaned into the one thing that never questioned him: work. When in doubt, he signed another contract. When cornered by journalists, he pointed to his call sheet. When hearts got curious, he deflected with headlines. And then, nearly 3 decades after his first strange encounter with a certain giant lizard, Hollywood came calling again. In 1985, Burr was offered the chance to reprise his role in a new Americanized version of Godzilla. To many, it seemed like a cash grab. Why would a respected, Emmy-winning actor return to a cheesy creature feature? But Burr said yes, not for the money, but for the fun. He once again played Steve Martin, though the name now posed an unexpected problem. Since the 1950s, another Steve Martin, the white-haired, banjo-strumming comedian, had risen to fame. So in Godzilla 1985, they simply avoided using the name altogether. Burr became Mr. Martin, a man caught between science and catastrophe, once again delivering grave warnings while looking slightly off-camera. And oddly, it worked. Fans embraced his return. Burr seemed at ease, almost playful in his role. But behind the scenes, the pattern was unchanged. Another project meant another deflection. Another reboot meant another reason not to explain why the man who played a father to the nation had no wife, no children, no story to share. It wasn't cowardice. It was conditioning. Hollywood had never made room for a gay leading man, not in the 1950s, not in the 1980s. Burr had spent his entire career building a character who was authoritative, stoic, untouchable. Revealing the truth about Robert, about love, would mean unraveling everything. So he kept working, and America, blissfully entertained, never noticed the silence behind the success. When the cameras stopped, when the studio lights cooled and the scripts were tucked away, Raymond Burr retreated, not to Beverly Hills or Bel Air like most of his peers, but to a quiet estate nestled in the hills of Sonoma County. A place where grapevines climbed in rows toward the sun, where the only sound was wind sweeping through olive trees and laughter between two men who had learned how to survive in silence. Here, far from gossip columns and intrusive lenses, Burr and Robert Benavides built a life that felt real. A vineyard, a home, a rhythm. They grew grapes, opened a winery, walked the land each morning like any married couple would, except they weren't married, not officially, not publicly, not in a world that would have punished them for it. To the outside world, they were business partners. The winery helped make that lie easier to sell. They appeared together at fundraisers, art shows, and local events, always with just enough space between them to keep the questions unspoken. Their love lived between the lines, visible only to those who knew how to read it. But for those close to them, there was never any doubt. Friends on the Perry Mason set had seen the way Burr looked at Robert when no one was watching. Assistants whispered their understanding with gentle nods. Party guests saw the softness, the comfort, the familiarity between two men who had grown up, and grown old, inside a secret. And yet, even here, in the peace of the countryside, Burr couldn't let go of the walls he had built. He didn't speak publicly about Robert. He didn't correct the lies he had once told. He simply chose to disappear into domestic quiet, tending vines instead of scripts, crafting wine instead of roles. There's something heartbreaking about that a man who spent his life telling other people's truths, defending the innocent, solving impossible cases on television, couldn't safely tell his own. That even as the world slowly changed, as younger actors started coming out and stories of LGBTQ love trickled into the mainstream, Raymond Burr still lived in the shadows of a story he couldn't rewrite. But if you looked closely, the truth was everywhere. It was in the laughter echoing off their stone patio during dinner with close friends. It was in the winery's label, which bore their shared vision. It was in the fact that Burr, at last, stopped inventing wives. He didn't need to anymore, because he had found the one person who made the lies unnecessary, if only behind closed doors. By 1993, Raymond Burr's body was failing, but his work ethic refused to let go. He was still filming Perry Mason television movies, still showing up in front of the camera, still playing the unshakable, unbreakable man America had trusted for decades. But off-screen, the truth was no longer something he could outrun. He had been diagnosed with renal cell carcinoma, kidney cancer, and by the time it was caught, it had already spread to his liver. There were no surgeries left to try, no miracle treatments waiting in the wings. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, this was the one plot twist he could not rewrite. And yet, even in decline, Burr did something extraordinary. He gathered the people he loved and threw farewell parties, not funerals in waiting but celebrations. He laughed, he reminisced, he toasted to memories and poured wine from the vineyard he had built with Robert. In the final days of his life, Burr finally stopped pretending. No made-up wives, no ghost sons, no script, just Raymond, just Robert. On September 12, 1993, Raymond Burr passed away in his Sonoma home, surrounded by the only truth that had ever mattered, and the only man who had stood beside him through every role, every reinvention, every secret. But even in death, there were skeptics, journalists who still questioned whether Robert Benavides had really been his partner, fans who clung to the myth rather than face the man. Hollywood, after all, had taught them well. The illusion was more comfortable than the truth, and then came the will. Raymond Burr left everything, every penny, every property, every bottle of wine, to Robert Benavides. His own family was written out completely. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't cruel. It was clarity. In that final legal act, Burr spoke the words he never could in life. This is the man I loved. This is the man who was my home. Benavides didn't grant interviews. He didn't need to. His grief was private, his dignity intact. He had already spent a lifetime loving someone in the margins. Now, at last, the truth was in bold print. Raymond Burr had lived as a legend. He had lied as a survivalist. But in death, finally, he told the truth. Raymond Burr died as he lived, controlled, composed, carefully curated. But in that final signature on his will, he dropped the mask. The man who had spent his whole life telling stories finally let the truth speak for itself. And maybe that's what made him a great actor after all. Not that he became Perry Mason or Ironside, but that he carried a secret with such conviction for so long that even the truth had to applaud when the curtain finally fell.